So on that note, good morning. And we do hope you're enjoying the conference. And as you probably know, we have a very full day planned for today. And at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Nora Loreto, who's a distinguished writer and activist based in Quebec City. Nora is the author of 3 books, From Demonized to Organized, Building the New Union Movement, published in 2013, Take Back the Fight, Organizing Feminism in the Digital Age, published in 2020, and most recently, Spin Doctors, How Media and Politicians Misdiagnosed the COVID-19 Pandemic, published in 2021. Very broad interests. She writes regularly for magazines and news organizations about politics, about the economy, and questions of justice. And she also teaches classes on media relations, social media, fighting the far right, and campaign organizing. And together with Sandy Hudson, Nora co-hosts the popular political podcast, Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. Today, Nora Loreto will be speaking to us about welcoming immigrants in an era of community obliteration. Please join me in welcoming Nora Loreto.
Wow. Thank you so much for that invitation, for that introduction, and for the invitation as well. This is really wonderful. Good morning. It's Tuesday morning. How are you? Yes, we're good. Yes. Okay. That's quite the title that we came up with for this talk. And I am going to be talking to you about this idea that community is being annihilated, that there is no such thing as community anymore. Okay, and I hope you're going to stay with me because I'm going to walk you through the logic on that, and you'll see very quickly what the implications of that is in your work. If you're not familiar with me, this presentation will be 2 parts depressing and 1 part comedy show. You will be laughing while you realize that everything is desperately bad. See? Okay. Now, you can't start a presentation like this without talking about the current political and economic context, which underpins everything about the work that we do. So, I don't need to tell you, we've had a pretty rough couple of years, right? Anyone have a good pandemic? Right? I mean, I kind of did, because I have twins, and so they played together, but, otherwise it sucked, right? And the impact of the pandemic, we know the impact, but the impact is also so profound that it will fundamentally change Canada for the next era. This is an era-changing thing. And at the same time that it's an era-changing, era-setting situation, we're also being told that, not that it's over, but that nothing happened, right? Sure, they're saying, the pandemic is, things are better, we're back. I mean, we're back together, this is wonderful. But the last 2 and 3 years, didn't even happen, right? March 2020 lasted for 18 months, and then we went on to April 2022, right? And that has created this very strange mental kind of world where we're all feeling the trauma and difficulty of the last 2.5 years with very little political expression for what we're feeling. So, and of course we can see this in the re-election, the overwhelming support in the re-election for people like Doug Ford or François Legault, and other elections that have happened since. And so we've gone through this 2.5 years, and where are we left? Well, we watched the federal government create the biggest social program in a generation, probably 2 generations, right? They created the CERB, the money that was supposed to help people get through the pandemic, but it left out a very important group of people, the poorest people, right? It left out the poorest people. And then they created a program to subsidize our wages. So if we were able to work, the government subsidized our wages, and that built into it wage inequality. So the inequality that already existed in the wages in the labor market meant that a white male would get more government funding through a higher wage than someone who's not a white male. And we haven't really contended with the impact of these kind of things. So we saw the government had the power in a very short period of time to create this massive new program to help a lot of people. It did help a lot of people, and then quickly kind of yank it away from folks. And so where does that leave us? Well, now we are facing inflation that can make you cry if you think about it too long. We have this housing crisis that doesn't seem to have a solution. It doesn't seem to have political champions other than the activists who are doing the work saying we need more affordable housing and this kind of thing. There's no political champion saying we're going to fix the housing crisis, and so things are going to get worse there. And then polarization. People have polarized around things that don't make any sense, right? Polarized around masks, right? Polarized around vaccines, polarized around these individualized interventions that were supposed to save us from COVID, and they haven't saved us from COVID because COVID requires a community response. COVID requires a collective response. And in the age of community obliteration, that's very difficult. And so we've got this difficult economy, rising inflation, wage stagnation, and of course I'm a little bit sick, everybody, so you're like very well socially distanced, sorry, Victoria. It's not COVID. Like for sure, it's not. And the housing market, that's very difficult, and a labor market that is just needing as many people as possible. And politicians seem incapable of actually doing anything. They seem incapable of saying, okay, like, ooh, this inflation stuff is a real problem. Let's just increase the interest rates, which is not a solution. It's going to make things actually worse for low-income people. This is all very bad news when you're working with people who are new to Canada and have to find a place to live and a good job and a community to support them. The shifting politics means that there are uneasy relationships within society right now, and those uneasy relationships, they explode into expressions of hate, expressions from the far right, and no one knows what to do about that. I mean, people do know what to do about that, but we don't have politicians that know what to do about that. So rather than talking about interventions or services or giving cooking classes to people that find themselves so socially isolated online that they are falling into the far right, we just have people saying we don't know what to do, we don't know what to do. And it really feels like things are slipping. It feels like things are getting worse. Things are getting worse. I mean, not to say anything of the healthcare crisis that we're dealing with right now. So before I start talking about how we can contend with these issues and solve some of these issues and work together to make things better, I think it's really important to understand conceptually how the hell did we get here? Like, at what point did this country kind of take a different path? You know, I picked up a book when I was at my parents' place that I think I got like at a garage sale 100 years ago. And it was a book written by Maud Barlow, who some of you might know from the Council of Canadians, and Bruce MacDonald from CCPA. And it was called Take Back the Nation from 1991. And it could have been written now, except it's like, this is getting bad, we got to stop. And now it's like, oh, no, it's bad. No, we missed the boat. Oh, my goodness. Okay, so how did we get here? The guiding philosophical understanding of society that has driven the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s is called neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is a philosophy that understands the individual as being the most important unit of society. And then the extension of that is their family, right? So the guy voting, and I'm going to vote for tax cuts or whatever, and that becomes the most important unit of society. Now, neoliberalism is something that is not new. It's defined this era, but we don't really popularly talk about it. It was dreamt up by Satan and put into the brains of Margaret Thatcher. And Margaret Thatcher was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to transform England, right? Ronald Reagan, same thing. We had it as well with Brian Mulroney. And when Thatcher was staring down the mining strike in 1984, her goal was to destroy community. Because under neoliberalism, the biggest threat is citizens, people getting together and fighting power. That's the biggest threat. So that means that every one of the political and economic reforms has to attack people getting together, has to make it feel weird and suspicious for us to work together, right? And so that's where you get sometimes these narratives that, like, you know, big corporations and big unions, they're all the same thing, right? Where it's like, no, they're literally opposite. Okay, they're on other sides of what we're talking about here. But the conception that we live within a community, and when I say we, I mean, I'm really frankly talking about white people, because when you're in a minority situation, you find community as a necessity, right? You find community to survive. I live in Quebec City, so I am a linguistic minority, and while I don't only socialize with Anglophones because of the language, it certainly is nice to have a group of people that I can speak in English to instead of French. And so the notion of community, of what brings us together, of caring for one another, this doesn't die in our humanity, right? Average people are still like want to work together and be together in communion with one another. But we've lost the spaces, we've lost the orientation, and we've lost the understanding of what that means. So, you know, for example, we've got this Tylenol shortage right now. And I've seen more people talk about driving to the United States to buy Tylenol than to say, okay, well, what about our communities? Like, who do you call if you need a dose of Tylenol at midnight? What friends do you have? What parent friends do you have? What neighbors do you have? You know, do you have any family? Oh no, I live by myself. We've had to move here because of the job. We just arrived. I'm fully isolated, right? These kinds of things that actually were very, very normal in, like, you know, the way that Canada was built. I start my first book by talking about my grandparents who were farmers in southwestern Ontario, just outside of London, and how they didn't have enough money to have all the farm equipment. And so there was like one combine for the whole road, and my grandmother would curse the days that she had to make meals for all of the guys working together because that was her job. And then they had no fridge, and it was bad weather, and all the food would spoil, and she'd have to do it again the next day because they would come back with the combine, and then they'd go to the next farm and the next farm and the next farm. That kind of collectivity was necessary, right? Because that's survival. That's the only way that you can survive in society. So we go through this period of the 1980s and the 1990s where things are transformed to be, okay, rather than talking about access to a doctor, rather than talking about public health care, we're going to vote against the deficit, right? Like this fake thing that doesn't actually exist, the deficit. We're gonna vote for tax cuts. We're gonna actually self-immolate rather than take our money and help one another. Like that seems really weird when you think of it like that. But the way that the policies happened was this is the de facto way that it did happen. And of course, the biggest cuts came in the most famous budget. Everyone must know this budget. The 1995 budget, right? The Chrétien-Martin budget, where $81 billion was pulled out of the Canadian state, right? And when it came to social services, I mean, the cuts when they combined the social transfers in 1995 set in motion incredible austerity at every provincial level that saw, you know, wait times in hospital rooms go through the roof, lack of access to doctors, tuition fees going through the roof. And it was the fundamental transformation of Canada that had been built in the shadow of World War II. You know, for all of its good and negatives, of course. You know, we forget that Canada was built and Western capitalist democracies were built in the shadow of 3 decades of mass death. Mass death from World War I to the Spanish flu pandemic to World War II. And while, of course, maintaining white supremacy, because I don't want to make it sound like it was all great, the way that modern states were built was to give people these services, to say, we want you to have access to health care. I'm not the state. I mean, people fought for this stuff, right? People fought for us to have rights, and people fought for us to have access to these services. And over a matter of decades, there's been a fundamental transformation of the state. And so fast forward to today, and that's where we are, is this feels like nothing's going to get better. We don't know what to do. The number of times I hear from people saying, I don't know, I've done everything. I mean, Nora, tell us what to do. And it's like, well, I mean, we have to talk about power. And we have to talk about how power operates in this country and who has power and who does not have power. And we know who does not have power, right? Poor people, racialized people, immigrants, refugees especially, very lacking power. And then who has power? The Galen Westons of the world, right? The folks that are able to say, oh yeah, sorry that your grocery bill has gone up 40%. Don't look at our profits, okay? And you're like, wait a minute. I'm gonna take a look at those profits. And so it gets us all into this situation where it feels like it's impossible to get out of. And as things have gotten worse, there's been even more focus on us being able to fight for changes through things like the electoral system, which is just not how it can be done, because the electoral system has been built to disenfranchise in a lot of ways. It was a system that was built to not give everybody the vote, and even as vote access expanded, it still didn't meet the needs that we have. And so, what does this all mean for integration and support for newcomers? I imagine you think about these issues all the time. I imagine that nothing I'm saying is surprising to you, because this is our lives. This is sadly what we are all up against. But really critically, how then do we build community when every political force in society of all political orientations, I mean, this is not a conservative problem, this is not a liberal problem, this is not an NDP problem, because all of the parties have the same logic. They're all operating in the same neoliberal space. So what does this mean for us trying to make sure that we have welcoming communities, that people are supported and not falling through the cracks? And I think, looking at COVID, I think the pandemic gives us a really good lesson of how easy it is for people to be erased. Right? So when we're talking about things like who was the most harmed by the pandemic? Who was the most harmed? We can look at different measures, but if you look at healthcare workers, overwhelmingly not white, right? Who are killed by COVID, that they got on the job. Many of them had no status or precarious status, the workers that died. Majority male, right? And when you look, in my book, I did an analysis of, the whole book is based on news, right? It's an analysis of news. And who was writing about COVID? Well, I cited 420 some odd journalists in my research, and only 29 of them were racialized men. Like, by definition, the ones most impacted by the pandemic. And so, of course, that gets erased, that gets written out of the story, we don't hear about it. What about COVID on reserve? I mean, COVID on reserves was a massive problem. It was a crisis. And without national level reporting, because of course of the jurisdictions, and reserves are federal jurisdiction, and that's still somehow like how journalism covers it, we didn't hear about these incredible outbreaks where you had full families just trying to survive for periods of time. With very little support, often, in remote or isolated regions, with very, very little access to healthcare. Again, erased from the narrative, erased from the story. Or let's talk about COVID spread, right? We always hear these narratives like, oh my gosh, COVID cases in Calgary are through the roof, or in Toronto are through the roof, or Montreal are through the roof. But it wasn't in the cities. It was in poor neighborhoods. It was in Montreal North. It was in Rexdale. Right? It was in places where people live closely together, where people travel in elevators together, where COVID is going to go between walls and ventilation systems, and again, not something that we talked about. And instead, the transformation of the identity of a Canadian in the pandemic was someone who lives in a single detached dwelling, that can have their own bathroom if they have to isolate, that certainly doesn't have roommates. I mean, there was one press conference with a medical officer of health in Hamilton saying that these young people were getting COVID. This was a big deal in July 2020, was talking about young people getting COVID because they were partying all the time, right? And the young person was like 40 and under, and it's like, what the hell? I'm not partying like as much as I'd like to. And when pressed on the question of risky behavior, she offered up, well, the risky behavior was having a roommate, right? That's the risky behavior of living with a roommate. To say nothing, of course, of undocumented workers and migrant workers who also paid a very high toll in terms of their lives and in terms of being stuck in Canada, right? At the end of the growing season in 2020, a lot of people just couldn't go home because they weren't sure they were going to get back. Quarantine meant that they'd have to stay because of COVID. And so if we look at the social dynamics that the pandemic laid bare, well, we actually can see very easily the social dynamics that are always present, that you're often coming up against, and that we need to navigate around. And so the first thing that I want us to consider when we're thinking about integration and support, and we've got this reality where there's community has been obliterated, how do we integrate someone into a community that doesn't exist? How do we appeal to the senses of community that still, they haven't stolen that from us. We're still humane, but we don't have the instincts. We don't have the networks necessarily that we would have had even 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And so how do we integrate people into that? And make sure that they don't fall through the cracks, and make sure that they feel welcomed, and make sure that they feel supported. You know, I think a lot about, my family was involved, my parents, my brother and sister-in-law, they sponsored Syrian refugees to Canada, and I mean, it's so precarious to have the families, you hope you have a good family, right? To be able to support the people that are coming in. And if you don't, I mean, it's good luck. Then the support services have to jump in there and do what they can. But it's so precarious to then, imagine we're going to get two couples are going to sponsor and do settlement, right? It's a very strange thing. Instead of communities, a town or a religious group and I know there was some of that as well. But the idea that anybody can do these things in these tiny familial units, sponsor a whole family and making sure that their kids are going to school and they're okay and they've got furniture and they've got a place to live. I mean, it's very funny. It's very strange to imagine that we would set a system up like that. But it's indicative of that lack of community, of that obliterated community feeling. So it requires then that we have community spaces and that those spaces be supported a lot. So things like, the library, which is such a critical hub for so many services. I mean, my dad's a librarian, or he was. So, I gotta shout out the libraries or else I don't get my inheritance. I'm kidding. He's gonna give me that anyway, I think. So libraries become really important. Public spaces become really important. Public spaces that you can hang out at. Public spaces that you don't get kicked out if you don't buy a coffee, right? Activity groups that are free, that do, sports, right? I'm a big soccer player. I think everyone should play soccer. And if you want to talk soccer with me after, we can talk about it. But having these kinds of services and accesses to community that is not based on your ability to get a job or your ability to learn a language. That's just your humanity as someone who's within a society. We have to seek out these spaces. We have to fight for these spaces to be properly funded. We have to save these spaces if they're being defunded. And we have to get creative, right? We have to think of, okay, so there's a crisis right now in community centers. No one can, we can't get any lifeguards, right? How do we get creative about making sure that we're not losing things because the pandemic has caused such damage to, skills development or access to these services or whatever. But it is important to remember that it is not the default, that when you show up in a small town, there's no longer kind of a community that's necessarily there to welcome you. And there's for better or for worse. That also means that maybe it's not going to be as hostile because the community is less organized against you. But that's perhaps too cynical a way to look at it. But that community bond is really, really important, and it really doesn't. It's not there anymore. Pretty much. That also means that spaces that religious spaces or cultural spaces, language-based spaces become really, really important. And again, we need to fund those and find ways to ensure that people have access to them, that they have time to go to them, and that we're making time, frankly, for fun. You know, I was talking to someone the other day who's from Chad, and he was like, I don't understand what it is about you Canadians, but you work too much. Like this is not normal, and it's not like this everywhere else in the world. I'm like, I know, and we're so proud of how much we work. So there is one kind of community, sadly, that has been very successful at organizing, and this becomes a huge problem for anybody that is not a jerk, which is that the far right is organizing. And the far right is organizing spaces that actually fill in these community gaps. You can see it in a lot of different ways. We can see it with the Freedom Convoy, right? That this 3-week thing in Ottawa, which I know was a nightmare for the folks living here, but like they had food, they had nonstop food, they're paying for people's hotel rooms, they're giving people fuel, they were creating community, you know, and it's very hard to look at something like that and say, oh my God, they did it. Like they did it. We, like, as a left-wing person who was really hoping that we could like mobilize, do something during the pandemic, and then it's the trucker convoy that did it. And you know, we had one in Quebec City, and I live on a street where they were like going literally around my house, so on 2 sides of my apartment, and I was like losing my mind and hating them and you know, cursing the whole day. And someone knocks on my door at 4 o'clock after the whole day of it, and I was like, I hate this person at my door right now. And I opened it, and it was a friend of mine, and he's like, hey, wow, you're right in the thick of things. How are you doing? I'm like, I hate this. I'm so mad. I hate these people. And he's like, yeah, totally. But isn't it amazing to see that they took over the streets? Like, everyone's got a goofy smile on their face right now. Everyone is happy to be together. And it was the same time as Carnival, right? And Carnival is supposed to be this moment of being like, we're going crazy, it's Carnival, right? And I was like, they did that. They did that for far right and hateful reasons, but they did it. And you can see why it was attractive to people. You know, it's not a coincidence that the far right looks for ways to fundraise, to support poor white people. This is something we see in Quebec City, where they do food drives, and they're very explicit about why they're doing the food drives. And they're filling in these gaps. Now, as the notion of a community doesn't exist anymore for white Canadians especially, this is where you see spaces created for white pride and white extremism, white nationalism to really flourish. You know, in Canada, we have a very scary level of hate crimes. Very scary level of hate crimes. I mean, we've had something like 30 people murdered in hate-motivated crimes in the last 7 years. And we don't talk about it in that way. Oftentimes, if it's a one-off or maybe 2 people, that person was, you know, maybe mentally ill, or maybe, you know, in the case of Quebec City, there was a stabbing on Halloween night in 2020. Nowhere in the media was it mentioned that this guy has a swastika on him tattooed that was covered up, but you can see it. And it's like, maybe he's an ex-Nazi who's still going out and stabbing people, you know. This is not something that we're able to contend with. And it is the direct result of white people feeling like, again, we have no community. Now, as a left-wing person, I want to inject that diverse community, that humanity amongst one another, to make sure that we do feel like we are part of something. But as these spaces disappear, we will see more people clinging to racist and far-right sentiment. And that becomes dangerous, not only because we'll have situations like the shooter in Quebec City, who you know, targeted the Grand Mosque in Sainte-Foy and murdered 6 people, who all were immigrants to Canada. But also because these ideas influence mainstream politics. And we see that very clearly with how the Conservative Party orients around it, but then also how the Liberals orient around it. Like, this is one of the difficult things when Bissonnette, the shooter in Quebec City, I mean, he had been planning to do a mass murder since he was 16, and he was 27 when it happened. We know this because of his sentencing hearing. And he actually went to the mall in November of 2016, one of the malls in Saint Foy, bag full of guns, and was ready to do a mass murder at the mall. And he decided not to because he thought that he was seen on a security camera, so he just sat in a Starbucks and didn't do it, and then went home. A couple months later, it was the tweet that Justin Trudeau sent out welcoming Syrian refugees that Bissonnette said, now I'm doing this, and I'm going to go to the mosque to do this. So, the rhetoric around how we talk about, immigration, turning it on, turning it off, using numbers as a way to scare people. I mean, we see this in Quebec all the time. This is dangerous, very, very dangerous. And so the work also has to be, how do we normalize talking about immigration? How do we normalize, talking about immigrants that not in a way of like just filling jobs or whatever, the most kind of shorthand way that journalists and politicians often talk about it, but about like what does modern Canada need and what does modern Canada look like, and how do we make modern Canada do the things that we want it to do? So that's a piece that we all need to figure out. And so this goes to my next point, which is that we have to confront this double pressure of immigrants being seen as the solution to solving the skills shortage versus classic xenophobic narratives that are around of immigrants stealing jobs, right? It's connected to this rise on the far right, and it's very insidious, and it's very dangerous. And it's not going to be politicians that are able to figure out how to talk about this stuff. It's going to be folks like you that are doing the work every day on the ground in your communities of like, how do we model and talk and fight back against these kinds of poisonous or toxic narratives? It's very difficult because we know, again, that politically, when we see the healthcare crisis and someone's like, well, we just bring people in from X. That's how we'll save the healthcare crisis. That is a way to both dehumanize and valorize immigrants' skills, right? It's a very difficult push-pull. And there is not enough civil society actors pushing against using immigration in these kinds of political ways by politicians. I think we also have to contend with this continued reliance on the temporary foreign workers program, and that it tells Canadians that foreign labor should be cheap and isolated and never integrated into society, right? That is what the program tells Canadians. We need to put as much pressure as we can to ensure that people that come to Canada through the temporary foreign worker program have access to immigration, have access to their job rights, have access to wages that are good and decent living conditions, rather than finding themselves, triple or quadruple bunked in these kinds of dorms. That was a big part of the pandemic, and I write about this in my book. The way that the farmers, especially in southwestern Ontario, were like, well, look at this amazing facility that all of my workers live in. Like, it's totally clean. And it's like, well, never mind that we know that COVID is going to go from person to person while they're sleeping, and that there's no privacy at all. But it's like, what? Like, why is this where they live? Like, this is not fair. This is not good. You're the boss. Like, you're not a hotel manager, and we had a glimpse of that, of the problems that are connected to that during the pandemic, but it has not been enough. And I think we also have to figure out how to deal with politicians who will say, we welcome and we love immigrants, we want immigrants to come to Canada, and then refuse to do the things that make it possible for people to be successful in this country, right? So you can't say that without then also saying, and here's the plan to fix the housing crisis, right? And oftentimes it gets, I challenge you to listen for the word complicated. Every time a politician or a journalist says something's complicated, what they mean is, I don't feel like explaining it to you, right? It always is. I'm always listening for that word complicated. It's like, oh my God, it's so complicated. It's like, it's not. It's actually not complicated at all. It's just maybe painful or difficult or expensive or takes a lot of people to be around the table, but it's not complicated. And so how do we push against these politicians that see this as being good for their brand or good for voters or votes, while at the same time then necessarily coding that as being their thing. So like, for example, completely theoretical example, the liberals are like, yes, we are the party that wants to welcome immigrants. Then conservative supporters are going to obviously be the ones who are opposed to welcoming immigrants. You know, like this is how the polarized camps find themselves to like an expression. And so we have to be like very, very, very clear. These are not issues that you can play with. They're not light issues. They're people's lives. And you can't make political hay off of someone's humanity in that way. You know, there's no single solution, obviously. I'm not going to say it's complicated, but it's definitely going to be a lot of work. But the final thing that I want to mention is related more to us all right now in society in general. This is going to be really philosophical, so if you didn't do philosophy in university, that's perfect, because you won't know that what I'm saying is wrong. I'm kidding. I didn't do philosophy in university. I don't even know what that is. So in addition to the transformation of our economy and of our politics through neoliberalism, we are in an incredible moment right now, a historic moment right now, of our own relations with one another. And those relations primarily are happening online, right? Our relations are happening through platforms that profit off of us. Every conversation that we have with a loved one, with someone we hate, with a friend, with a neighbor, with whatever, is making money for somebody, right? Our relationships are being commodified. And sometimes it's necessary. It's the only way to talk to certain family members. It's the only way to send anything, money, send love, send maybe gifts, right? We have to use these platforms a lot of times to be able to stay in touch with people that we love. I mean, because we can't do letters anymore, because that's too, letters are like hipster stuff now, right? We don't do letters anymore, unless they're cards. Cards are nice. And so when every one of our interactions is being commodified and profited off of by a for-profit corporation that we have not only no control over, but that actually probably hates us, has doesn't care at all about local laws or taxation laws. I mean, Facebook doesn't pay tax in Canada at all. This is very, very bad. On top of that, we live in these profiles, and our profiles are perfectly tuned to what we're saying, what we're clicking on, what we're looking at. We have we talk about silos online, and you'll see how I can get back to why I'm talking about this. We talk about silos online. It's not silos. It's that we have perfectly curated rooms, individual rooms that don't look like anyone else's, and that are adorned with the things that we like, the things that we dislike, what the algorithm thinks we want to see. And so all of our needs get given to us by these platforms, and we lose commonality with other people. We lose commonality with our siblings because we don't have the same likes, we don't have the same room as them. We lose commonality with the people that live in our neighborhood or that we work with, and we don't even see it, right? We can't even see how isolated the technology has made us. And I think that when you can't see it, you assume that everyone has a similar experience to you, to some extent. I mean, I don't mean like personal, like actual experiences, but that you might react to the same kind of public policy or comment from a politician or joke as someone else. I assume my experience that I have online is pretty similar. Well, maybe not my experience online, but that will be an inside joke for the folks in the room that know what I do online. But, we assume that our experiences are not that different. But we're so manipulated by these platforms. We're so controlled by these platforms that if we're trying to imagine creating community, creating welcoming community, we need physical touchstones that are not commodifying our every single interaction, right? We need common things like, a newspaper, so that I'm not just seeing the news that the algorithm wants me to see or that I want to see, But then maybe I'll be like, oh, that was a bad article, whatever. And then I can talk to someone about it because we have a common platform. Doing integration in this world where there is no longer common experiences and common places is going to be very difficult. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult. And so we have to hold on to the things that do exist, that are common, that we can still have in real life, the relationships, the social events, the struggling together, finding places in our workplaces that allow us to have these kinds of common experiences, to push back against this wave of hyper isolation and individualism. Because the sad reality is there's no politician that's reigning in these platforms. I mean, sometimes the platform gets bought by someone that totally self-immolates, and that might just destroy Twitter, but honestly, I'll be really sad if that happens. But there's nothing is going to make this better that we can see yet. And all things are indicating that it will get worse. And so we have to be very, very clear-eyed in what is happening with our interactions with one another. Because if we don't understand that, then we are always going to be pushing up against something that's invisible, something that's impenetrable, something that we don't really understand is manipulating us or changing us or stopping us doing something, and we're going to burn out. We're going to feel like we've tried everything. Nothing is working. We cannot change politicians' minds. We can't change public policy. We're not getting people together. We can't make people feel like they're being supported if we don't, because we can't see this thing, because this thing is invisible, because it's around us all. And so I hope that you think about that and think about what that means in your work and your interactions with other people and how damaging it is and how much we have to resist it. We have to resist it. The most radical thing, and I'm really into radical stuff, so the most radical thing that we can do in this era is create community. And that community needs to be surprising. It needs to be a not racist hot tub in front of the Peace Tower, right? I mean, when they had those hot tubs out in the middle of January at the Freedom Convoy, I was like, okay, like a hot tub, that's pretty nice. Like, that's cool. It needs to be surprising. It needs to shake people out of complacency. And it needs to excite and bring joy, because that's also something that we've been like sorely lacking. So I know that we have the creativity in this room to be able to meet challenges that are facing us all. No one individual is going to be the one to do it at all. This is not an individual thing. There's no one politician that's going to fix it. There's no one public policy that's going to fix it. It is the sum total of all of our actions together. It is the sum total of us being together, of thinking together, of struggling, of debating, of bringing together spaces for people directly impacted by the policies to lead the direction that your organizations will take. And that's the only way that we will make anything better. But I also don't doubt that that is how we will make things better. That is going to be the way that we solve the housing crisis, that we make this country hospitable and open to the people who are coming to it, and in so doing, making this country better for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. And we're going to now go into a Q&A. And please submit your questions through Slido. Vote on other people's questions. I see there are already some in there. And they should come up on the screen.
Okay, we'll just go like this? Yeah. Amazing. All right, so the first question, since nonprofits are a neoliberal product and immigration settlement sector is heavily nonprofit, how do we support communities and navigate our contradictions? My second book on the feminist movement actually touches on this a lot, as you can imagine, because within the feminist movement, it's the same thing, that a lot of activism has been replaced by not-for-profit service provision. And that's a neoliberal reform, right? Governments don't have to do the work if they can get other people to do the work. And then the activists who normally would be fighting the government are the ones doing the service provision, and they're too busy, right? So that's how that works. And so I think that not-for-profits, we have to really see, like, if you are being stopped from doing activism, there's a reason for that. And you have to figure out, are you able to navigate that world and do the activism that's necessary to change things? Because every not-for-profit that exists because there's a problem within society. You're filling a gap, right? You're doing some work that society is not able to do through government structures. And so you have to be activist groups. That is difficult, though, because I know that there's a lot of opposition to that, and so you have to be clever about it. And I think also unapologetic. You know, one of the things I hear all the time with my podcast is Canadians are really afraid. Like, we're a really, like, fearful bunch, and everyone's afraid of being fired. Everyone, like, Nora, you don't understand, I'm going to get fired. Oh my God, you don't understand, I'm going to get fired. Everybody, doesn't matter the sector, doesn't matter where they're from, doesn't matter who they are, everyone's afraid that they're going to lose their job. And I want to say, like, maybe you might lose your job, but we need a lot more courage in this country. And I really encourage people to think about what courage could look like while you're kind of confronting some of this stuff. So yeah, so recognizing not-for-profits, literally part of the neoliberal state, and our goals should be to make sure that the services that the not-for-profits offer are actually available through public services. But again, that's not to say that you need to destroy your not-for-profits. I mean, this is the system that we have, and so use them well, and use them in a way that helps as many people as possible. Am I seeing examples of community that giving me hope? Yes, of course. If I had no hope, I would be lying down, not here right now, crying. So I think that the most exciting thing for me is Indigenous resistance and Indigenous solidarity, and groups that are reclaiming language, groups that are reclaiming culture, language camps, bringing young people to learn how to tan hides. I mean, there's a lot of really amazing work that's being done within Indigenous communities, and that gives me a lot of hope. But, you know, honestly, like, people are still great. Like, the systems and the structures that I talked about are what are imposed on us. People are still awesome. So, I mean, I have a lot of hope just because people are great, and people don't want to be stuck in the box that they're in. And so, I mean, I'm sure that many people in this room give me hope, right? Because there is always hope, and we just can't, like, hope is also something that we just can't, you can't get too hopey, because we got to start doing stuff as well, right? What do you think about the idea in discourse that immigrants have to be grateful for the opportunity that Canada gives this? That is racist, right? You have to be grateful. We have to push back against this stuff, right? When someone comes to Canada, they are leaving something, and that's difficult. And I don't have to tell a lot of you that, obviously. But this whole idea of gratefulness, again, that's very Canadian, and it's wrapped up with this idea that Canada is the best country in the world, and aren't you lucky that Canada pulled your number, right? Aren't you lucky? So I think that we need to be loud and clear about rejecting that kind of narrative and calling it for what it is, frankly. It seems we've taken for granted that everyone in this room is of the left or has no choice than being on the left. Are we not about inclusion and diversity? Very good question. I do not assume that everyone in this room is on the left at all. In fact, I'm sure a lot of you voted conservative. Yeah? Anyone want to say, maybe? No, you don't have to do it. I am a socialist, so I am a left-wing person, and being a socialist means that I believe in democratic control of everything, of your workplaces, of everything. That's what I personally believe. Being a socialist is also lonely, and I do not assume that I'm in a room full of socialists, though maybe someday I might be. Diversity and inclusion, when it comes to political orientation, is a bit of a wacky notion, because these are opinions. This is not identity. And we have to, like, people don't have a political identity all the time. There are people that are longtime voters of a specific party. There are people that might vote for one party no matter what that party does. But the vast majority of Canadians are not taking on a political ideology as their identity. So, I mean, I hope that we can debate, because I think debating is very, very important. I personally don't see a right-wing path to diversity and inclusion for immigrants that is workable and not, like, full of, like, weird problematic traps, but maybe I'm wrong. What I do encourage, though, is that we debate, Because the other thing that we have lost with social media and our reliance on the internet is we don't know how to debate anymore, right? I mean, I love debating, and I think debating is struggle, and it brings us to the best answer. And I mean, I personally, as a socialist, am fully not partisan. Like all three federal parties, I'm like, not my business. Like, I do not care about these things. And so I have no problem being able to say, well, let's look at these policies. What makes this policy a left-wing policy? And then we can have that conversation. And usually the answer is because it confronts power. It's a left-wing policy because it confronts power, and it takes popular power, the power of the people, to change something versus corporate power or patriarchal power or whatever. So if you want, whoever asked that question, you want to debate with me later, I would love that. That'd be great. If you think government is failing, what is your proposed solution to the housing crisis? Oh, that's an easy question. Yeah, so, we need more affordable housing. Like, we need to take profit out of the commodification of the housing market. I mean, oh my God, something like 40% of rental homes in this country are owned by like hedge funds. You know, like we have a massive problem with the financialization of real estate in this country. And the financialization of real estate means that, you want a safe investment, and you're like, I don't want to invest in war. And they're like, okay, great. And I don't want to invest in fossil fuels. Okay, great. So here's a safe investment. It's called a REIT, right? A real estate trust. And we have commodified our entire housing market. If you look at the data in terms of like rents and mortgages in Canada compared to any other country, I mean, we are way higher. Through the pandemic, our housing costs have spiked way higher than anywhere else. And I don't think we understand this, because the question says to me like, well, Nora, like, you think you know so much, what's the fix? The fixes are easy, actually. The problem is that there's no political will, because politicians are more interested in the financial markets to make sure that they make money for people that will support them than to make sure everybody is housed. There are tons of easy solutions, like, mandating that banks allow for collective mortgages so that families can buy multi-unit dwellings together and create co-ops, something that does exist in Quebec. That would be something that would be easy to do. They haven't done that. And then, of course, as I say, just building more stock, that would be easy to do. That is happening in some communities, but it's not enough. But the problem is that if we think that the status quo and these kind of small fixes to the status quo are going to fix the housing crisis, we are very wrong. So hopefully that got that answer for you. Yes. Thank you. All right, I love this. This is like rapid fire. Okay, a lot of newcomers in Canada come from places that really care about community. And how do you think we can empower them so they can bring their communities here? Great question. So one of my big lessons when I was in the student movement was from international students who'd come to Canada and be like, man, your student movement is like not cool. Where I come from, like, we have like an army and we are powerful. And I'm like, wow, we have so much to learn from you. Yes, like, absolutely. We need to be able to talk about these kinds of differences and how, the obsession with Canada as being the best country in the world has really limited our ability to actually learn from other people. And so I really hope, like, one thing that would be really neat is if people could be bringing those kinds of stories in a higher profile way, or trying things out in a different way to say, this is how we do this. This is how we do this in Colombia, and it's really great. And let's see if we can do this in Hamilton. Those kinds of projects would be amazing, and would be led by the people like with the most experience, which would make it also very cool. And I think, like, Canadians, if we don't know what we don't know, then it's very, very difficult to be able to propose these kinds of interesting and probably radical, in our context, kind of solutions. So share those stories, give people the resources necessary to actually do those projects and to inject that community. Because again, I am talking about a Western capitalist kind of reality, right? That's us, United States, Western Europe, and the rest of the world has a lot to teach us. What do you make of social media groups like caremongering that mobilize different regions early in the pandemic as grassroots community movements? So grassroots community building is really important. And I think that the fact that people rushed to do these things is that hope that I was talking about. that's where you see people really wanting to do something. I hate that it goes through these platforms because, again, then our helping one another is commodified and making someone money. But oftentimes that's all we have. And so, I mean, I'm on Facebook. Like, this is not something, I'm not calling everybody to get off of these platforms. And then sometimes they get a bit weird, right? Sometimes there's like weirdness in them and in your like neighborhood groups that we have to kind of stay on top of. But I think that, yes, like there is a desire for people to help other people. And what we need to do is find physical space to do it. Because a lot of these groups exist only online. And so it's like, oh, you know, we can maybe bring you this, or, oh, does anyone have that? I can help you. But if we have physical spaces, then actually that's where you start to be able to feed people. That's where you actually can bring people together and have maybe a small library or something like that. Drop-in spaces are really, really, really critical, and they allow people to self-organize the things that they're interested in. So yes, awesome. That's our natural state, I think. Our natural state is to help one another, and when a pandemic or some sort of crisis happens, we have a natural desire to help each other, and I think that that's wonderful, and honestly, I mean, that's what drives me, like knowing that that spirit is still, you know, they can't take that away from us. It's easy to criticize government policies from the outside. Why is there no acknowledgement of the actual policies in place that are actually working? I was not asked to talk about that. I mean, no, I mean, like, I could also talk about, you know, feminism. Like, yeah, what's actually working? I mean, sorry, I'm like, you know what's actually working, and then do that work, right? That's great. If there's things that are really working well. I see a lot of stuff that's not working well, and I see a lot of pain, and I see a lot of people that are suffering, and it breaks my heart, and I'm sure it breaks your hearts as well, and maybe next year you'll invite me back to talk about the wonders of the Liberal government, but probably not.
One more question, and we can finish.
Oh gosh, okay, pick one.
Pick one.
Yee. Oh my gosh, these are so good. I don't know. They're so different. Okay. No. Okay. Well. Okay. Can we expect underfunded and underpaid workers to tackle these challenges if they themselves need support? Or how are we contributing to the problem? Yeah. So I mean, well, I first of all, if someone who's not underpaid in this room, I'm challenging you the most. If you're well paid, like you should be doing like everything that you can in this stuff. I think that, you know, people who are underpaid and who are struggling, they're doing a lot of the work as it is. This is not a call for folks to do even more. It's a call for us to reorient our perception and our perspectives on what is possible. And so, you know, I think that those of us who have the energy and the time to bring sense to a lot of the problems that we have, that's where we can then work with people. And yeah, underpaid and overworked folks, well, then we look for ways and say, what would you need to be able to maybe get involved in something? And it's like, well, I need childcare, free childcare, and I need meals. If I'm going to be at an event, I need to be fed. No problem. You know, then we're going to do that. That's how we're going to organize ourselves, right? But let's not think that like we're down. This is not the work of like the poorest among us. It's the work for all of us. It's the work for all of us, and we have to find ways to use the resources that we all have to fight some of these things, make these things better, that kind of thing. Okay, our youth panel, last question. Our youth panel seem to find it difficult to define what it means to identify as Canadian and whether it's important. Is this liberating or troubling? That is, I mean, wonderful question. I think Canadian identity, what is it to be a Canadian? I mean, the problem with this country is that a lot of what it means to be Canadian is a myth, and underneath the myth is a lot of stuff that's not that good. Right? I am not surprised that someone would struggle to identify what Canadian identity is, because we often identify ourselves in opposition to the United States. And it's not enough. An identity is not like, well, I'm not them. That's not an identity, but that is our identity, like far too often. And so I think that what is interesting about this is it means that we actually are in a space where identity in this country is mutable, and that is liberating. It means that we can always mold what Canadian identity is through our actions and through our ideals and our understandings. and build things that are positive, that we can be proud of, rather than, necessarily focusing all the time on the things that aren't great. Although, I mean, maybe I'm a bit guilty of that. But, but the reality is that Canada is really big. And one of the things that I realized when I moved to Quebec is that we are really regional. We are really regional people. And the regional identities that we hold are really important, actually, in English Canada. Identifying with the region that you live in, identifying with the communities that are associated with that region, whether that region's a province or if it's a part of a province. And then so Canada becomes kind of fake, because actually, like, as a Torontonian, my identity of being Canadian is completely different as someone from Prince George. And I don't think that that's bad, actually. I do think, though, that we don't have any national kind of discussions on this question. And honestly, Canadian identity is one of my biggest passions. I love thinking about Canadian identity, and I challenge you all to think about what it means for you and how you act that identity out, whether it's in your work or if you're outside of Canada, how you act out that identity. So thank you for the questions. They were really, really great, and thank you again. Thank you so much for having me.